in a real sense. Max Dupayne's Sunbaker, one of the most iconic photographs in the world, in this country. Modernism was also the beginning of industry, the beginning of, industry was starting to gear up, and industry was considered good. Today we're going through this kind of love-hate with industry and pollution, but the modernists had no problem with industry. It actually was solving a lot of the problems of their life. And this is Grace Crowley, and you can see that she's using industrial angles and geometric patterns. I mean, the nature and flow of industry in modern Australia was considered very positive. A wonderful modernist picture, even it's a landscape, but you can see that the brush stroke is intense, it's direct, the colour palette has gone much higher key. We've got industry, always industry, electricity, and the bridge, which you will see. The bridge changed Sydney. The bridge was a fascination for artists. I can't imagine any contemporary artist today doing anything on a bridge. No one's interested in bridges anymore, we've moved on. But the bridge was a literally bridging of a city. It was about industrialisation, it was about huge engineering undertaking, it was about putting a man on the moon for them, you know. And this was one of the largest single-span bridges in the world. It was an engineering feat in its day, and it's still a marvel. And, you know, she's used modernist techniques, modernist palette, and a modernist sensibility to show you know, industrialisation. You know, simple domestic scene in the sense this is a cafeteria. Cafeterias were opened up. Department stores started to have people come and gather in public spaces and drink coffee. That was totally radical. People had entertained in their houses. Now in the early modernist period they started entertaining in public spaces. This was, I think it was Grace Brothers in Sydney. You know, there's people behind the counter making some probably crazy milkshakes. And this is middle-class people, and what Grace Cossington Smith has done has used the repetition of the furniture to kind of parallel the repetition of the bridge. Industrial repetition is a product of machines. The use of indigenous motifs started to creep in by, again, these incredibly funky women who for the first time started to see indigenous culture in a way that other artists hadn't done. Margaret Preston, she's using a colour palette which definitely references indigenous designs. We can talk about that later. And of course, just like the Edwardian period comes to a screaming heap with the First World War, early modernists really came to a screaming heap with the Second World War. This is Tucker, and these are good time girls in Melbourne going out with American troops. You know, they were over here, they had more money than us, they were oversexed, they stole our women, you know, that kind of attitude. You know, the promiscuity was becoming an issue. You know, all of a sudden people were starting to have war sensibilities as opposed to Victorian sensibilities. Modern art, where the early modernists is starting to become modern art, and to late modern art, starts to look tougher. It's tougher. We live in a tougher world. We're at war, and the war has consequences. You know, this is a fantastic Tucker. This is the start of surrealism starting to come through in work. This is starting to look at the psychological profile of people. This is about an outcome of war. This is about, you know, a whole range of... Look at the colour palette, it's fantastic. It's in a psychiatric ward. And this is people like Tucker, the painter, who is actually revisiting our early exploration past of people who go into Australia and actually open us up, but he's doing so in a very modernist way. These early explorers he's seeing are pretty unusual, surrealist people with these kind of rat birds who are constantly, you know, feeding on them. And Russell Drysdale, one of Australia's great painters, again English originally. Surrealism was big during this period. I mean, the war had gone. Surrealism started really early in the 20s overseas and became huge in the 30s, but the war kicked another breath into surrealism, and this period was, surrealism kind of went through all, you know, the outback was hard, it was difficult, it was spooky. This is actually a painting in the former Queen Mother's collection, so it's in the Royal Collection in England. We gave them lots of nice things. We still do. This is a soldier coming back from war. I mean, you know, it's what we would think, it could be Afghanistan today or Iraq. It's people coming back from an experience which was horrific, and they're being met by their family and their friends outside their old home. You know, it's slightly surreal in the use of the sky and the trees. You know, wonderful painterly technique, wonderful. He did a lot of black, and it was often oil tar. You know, he just oil. He added sump oil. It was, you know, again, Drysdale, the psychological profile. You know, this realism coming through to Australia. These are tough things, you know. Drysdale again. This is probably, without doubt, one of Australia's most significant paintings, still in private collection. It has surrealist elements. It's Drysdale, and it is of cricket, which is a national sports phenomenal thing. Of this period, you know, we're starting to integrate ourselves with the Australian environment. You know, if we arrive here and we stick to the coast and we're scared of the fire and we're scared of getting lost and it's really big and spooky, you know, after the war comes along, a whole generation of Australians start to relax and move out into the suburbs and out into the bush. And we have a lot of this is the architecture which actually starts to blend in as opposed to dominate. Remember that house way back? The dominant landscape? I'm really important, this is a really important house, I'm a really important person. This is not saying that. This is actually saying I'm leaving a very light footprint. I'm actually blending in the landscape. I'm using materials which are appropriate. I'm actually building a house which actually suits the environment as opposed to makes a statement. You know, the bush came up to the house. They're not scared so much anymore. You know, the house is in the bush. I mean, it's a fire risk, but they're not freaked. Modernist furniture, a Schillam Krimpner. Again, after the war, we had a massive influx of people just before and just after the war, particularly from Europe. This country has been built on people coming from somewhere else. At the end of the Second World War, there were 6.5 million Australians. There are now 22. Right? Virtually all people have come here from somewhere, from Australia from somewhere, and most of them actually, their roots came after the Second World War, and a lot came with the Snowy Mountain scheme, and a lot were incredibly talented refugees, both just before the war fleeing the Nazis and after the war fleeing the destruction of Europe. So this was I think Schillam was a Hungarian cabinet maker who went to Melbourne. Beautiful modernist sensibilities of wonderful lines, but a very traditional piece of furniture in its sense, but beautifully modern. Again, the Aboriginal decorative. This is not an Aboriginal work. It's actually by an Australian potter as such. But the use of Aboriginal motifs, again, it's about appropriation at this period. We don't really understand the people that were here before us, and we don't really fully appreciate them. Blackman in the 1950s. Again, we're now becoming quite an urban view. I mean, Australia's, you can see it's lost the wide brown land. We've lost the sheep are gone, okay? We are now not looking at agriculture, we are now looking at ourselves. We are now looking at the world we inhabit, which is actually in the city. This was a whole series of work he did on schoolgirls, based on his wife, Barbara Blackman, and Barbara was blind. And so all the women are without faces. And he met her as a schoolgirl. And this is I think this is a gas plant. Yes, in fact, it's called the gasometer. There you go. John Brack, you're about to go to Melbourne. There's a classic late modernist picture. You know, the grey humanity, the kind of almost industrial, you can see, workers in the city from the 1950s. I included this, although I'm going to talk about Aboriginal art later. You know, this was really at the beginning of our first significant brush with Aboriginal people, and it was, as long as they painted like us, it was okay. This is Albert Namatjira, who was a master of watercolour, an extraordinary artist, who was enormously successful and made a lot of money. But because he made a lot of money and he was an Aboriginal person, he didn't pay tax. So he was the first Aboriginal to be made an Australian citizen so they could tax him. You've got to love bureaucracy. But we can talk about him. But yeah, again, you know, I mean, I'm talking about our first, it's a very Western watercolour. This is a very important series, and this was again looking at our relationship with Indigenous people. It is called the Bride series, and it's about a relationship between an Aboriginal man and a white woman, and how it all ends disastrously because she is not accepted by his world and he is not accepted by her world. So it's about dislocation, it's about poverty, it's about, I guess, a modern group of artists who in fact are starting to go back into Australia and explore it with modern sensibilities, looking at it in a different way. Really important work. This is a painting also from that series where there's the bride and he's gambling her for cards. She's the actual prize. Sydney Nolan, Luna Park in Melbourne, you know, a great kind of late modernist work. The angles, the kind of deconstruction of the things you see, the colour palette. He painted with often with Riplin, which was a paint that was used for cars. So even their textiles, even the things that they used were completely different. They weren't using oil paint, they were using car paint. The modernists were actually moving on. This is one of the great series of Australian art. This is the Kelly series by Nolan. You know, when I did the bushranger thing way back in there and the importance of the bushranger community, well, Nolan revisited our great myth, Ned Kelly. Ned was Irish, quite well-to-do, psychopathic murderer who robbed from the rich to give to himself. And he had a last stand where he was gunned down. He was kind of like a Jesse James figure, if I can use that American analogy. He forged out of agricultural steel a series of armour where he actually had a helmet and he had a breastplate, and he met them in the last stand, and it was very dramatic until they shot him in the feet and he fell over. But he is central. This is a very central point to the Australian character. I don't know how many Australians are in this room, but Kelly was Irish Catholic. He was fighting, he was kicking back. The people who really aiming at were the police. In our national character, in a sense, we are fighting back. We distrust authority tremendously. We're lawlessness. There's a kind of an element of the Irish Catholic lawlessness that is in our nation. And this myth of Kelly and how he actually fought the police and kind of won until he got killed. He was hung, and when he was hung, his last words were, "Such is life." Very famous saying. So Nolan picked up this incredible kind of myth of Australia, of this particular lawlessness of our character, and actually did a really important series in the 50s, which is probably one of the defining mid-20th century Australian groups of works. This Kelly that becomes a little bit of in us all, in a sense. This is a photograph taken by Russell Drysdale, which I've shown you some of his work. He was sent out in the 50s again to highlight the drought. The newspaper in Queensland said, go out and take some photos and come back and show the drought. He came back with photos they couldn't print. They were considered so horrific. But he took them in a very modernist way. I mean, he used his photography as kind of an extension of his painting. And he highlighted the horrors of drought in these kind of twisted, these kind of, surreal, spooky horror of the drought, which of course at the time, these are really tough pictures. And of course we're starting to move on now in the 60s and Fred Williams. Fred Williams defined Australian landscape, an artist that's heavily collected by people like the British Museum and so forth. I mean, Williams was one of those artists which kind of picked the landscape up, which we've always been engaged with. I've shown you lots of landscape paintings. But in his generation in the 60s, Williams picked up the landscape and completely twisted it to this kind of aerial view. And there's sparseness. They're very Australian. They're not these big forests of England. They're the sparse bushlands of Australia. John Olsen from the same period. Klippel. Fairweather. He was completely bonkers. He was a genius, possibly. He certainly could draw like Raphael. He had a beautiful hand. He won the Slade Art Prize as a student for drawing, and he lived in Bribie Island. He was an absolute alcoholic, and at one stage he built a raft and set off to rediscover northern Australia, and he was found thousands and thousands of kilometres later up near Papua New Guinea on a raft. Quite extraordinary man. Again, late modernist, layered his work endlessly, never almost finished it, layered upon layer upon layer upon layer. Again, 1960s, David Moore. This is when actually Australia, you know, people came to Australia. You know, iconic images of people arriving, people saying goodbye. You know, it was a really, demographically, a huge period. All the way with LBJ. You know, the 1960s, Vietnam War, our American alliance, Tucson, beginning in Australia, we could equate this to kind of abstract expressionism in America. It's kind of these energy paintings where people exploded their feelings onto canvas. This is not about depicting something, it's about expressing in a massive emotion. It's about, you know, it's about the immediacy of the actual endeavour. These are explosive, Jackson Pollock-esque, throw your canvas at, you know, paint at the canvas. He was an incredible collector of Aboriginal art, and he was responsible for largely the collection of Aboriginal art at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. He was a very far-sighted person. Jeffrey Smart, going right into late modernism here, and we have, you know, urban sensibilities. Brett Whiteley, the quintessential Sydney artist. Lavender Bay, this is looking up through the studio. That's his then wife, Wendy. Matissean blue, he kind of lived a Matissean life. His paintings were about beauty, about sexuality, about Sydney, about Wendy. They were self-biographical. He was an extraordinarily inventive and creative mind. Again, I wanted to throw this in because we're looking at architecture as well, in a sense. And this is Glenmurcutt, and this is Australia. And this really is interesting because not only do we have that fascination of Australia in the bush, you know, we're not kind of pushing it away, the vernacular is Australian. This is basically a house built on the view of a shearing shed. So it's bringing kind of vernacular of agricultural Australia back into a contemporary way. Wonderful. Ken Wisson, Dale Frank, Rosalie Gascoigne. Well, this is kind of into the 90s now, and we've had a fairly orderly kind of visual progression. I can't have time to explain it all, but this is really fantastic. Rosalie Gascoigne was actually a New Zealander. Australians often claim the achievements of New Zealanders as their own. It's a national characteristic. She was a fantastic New Zealander who married an Australian and lived in Australia. So she's ours, okay? And her husband was a very famous astronomer, and they lived at Mount Stromlo. And she was a very bright woman. And he worked at night time. So she was alone, and she was stuck out in Canberra. Have anyone ever been to Canberra? The land that time forgot. And she would wander around Mount Stromlo, which was completely fenced off. You couldn't go there, so only she who lived there could go. And she would find things, and there was a rubbish tip at Mount Stromlo, and these were Schweppes drinks crates. You got your soft drink in Schweppes crates, and she cut them up and she reconfigured them. She started life, her first great interest was ikebana. It was the positioning of things. And so here she's using the positioning that she's learnt through ikebana with the soft drink crates that she's found wandering around, and she's created this amazing landscape. She did a series of works on landscape, very important. Ben Quilty, currently one of the darlings of Australian art, noticed that, you know, the explosive, buttery use of paint. which has become quite a trend in today's art. It's a Tirana, which of course is a major baby booming icon. Very important work. Bill Henson, probably our greatest living artist. Again, what makes a lot of Bill's work, and in fact, indeed, what makes a lot of contemporary artists really interesting, is the way they reference the classical or go backwards. A lot of contemporary art, to be good, actually goes backwards to go forwards. And Bill has referenced almost a marble or Greco-Roman sculpture. In fact, and the colour and the use of light and is actually quite like the Dutch painter Frans Hals. The use of black. Frans Hals painted in 44 shades of black. You know, his use of black was amazing, and you can see that the use of this kind of old master techniques of shade and light and the classical references make this Bill Henson a very interesting photographer. Marion Drew, who's just had a major show at the Musée de Quai-Branly in Paris, uses roadkill often. I think this is roadkill, animals that get hit and are found dead, and she actually then positions them in a still life, which is actually remnant of a Dutch 18th century painting. So she's gone back to go forward. Beautiful work. Sean Gladwell, who's an Australian entrant at the Venice Biennale, he is also quite a famous skateboarder, and this is a portrait of Sean. Sean says, I'm actually better known in skateboarding circles for my feet than I am known to the public for my face. So when I want to actually depict who I am, I depicted my feet. He had a really bad accident on his skateboard, and these are quite serious burns and injuries, and he puts mercurochrome all over them, and he puts his foot on an industrial scanner and scans his foot, which is backlit, and he says, that's me. Self-portrait. It's quite groovy. Lindy Ivermy, an important Australian sculptor, she uses chicken bones to create these kind of spooky gothic Cabbage Patch dolls. It's to do with kind of fetish, and it's to do with a lot of the medieval notion that the saints, bits and pieces of the saints were kept. You know, Saint Jerome died and they cut him up, you know, they cut the saints up and put a finger in this abbey and a leg in that abbey, and they kind of butchered these poor people. And she's referencing that kind of fetishistic medieval practice of bones. Lionel Bowden, who makes these wonderful curvaceous sculptures out of pencils. Faber-Castell love him, and he does these kind of organic shapes. Danny Mellor, a really important urban Indigenous artist, but we might talk about that another time. But again, referencing classical, it's almost like a cartouche, a vignette of an 18th or 19th century volume. Classical mythology with the Aboriginal people and the fauna and flora of the birds and the kookaburra, the possums, the rosellas, the dingoes. You know, Adam Cullen with Ned Kelly, this continual referencing of our past, and you can see that this is Ned Kelly's armour. It's called Big Red Ned. John Young, Chinese-Australian, he's using digital background. This is a digital print. It's actually a 18th century Jesuit manuscript that went to China from a very important Jesuit missionary. He's laid that down, and on top of it he's painted this ghostly apparition, and this is a ghostly apparition that comes to the artist when he's in trouble, and it has come to him for 30 years. He could be schizophrenic. Deborah Powie, contemporary photography, you know, is a huge component of any contemporary culture worldwide these days. She's a really interesting person. She lives in Australia. Her parents were American. They were kind of very serious, born again from the Midwest, and she has some growing issues with that, and all her work is kind of self-referential in this kind of really spooky kind of internal psychology, and all her subjects are faceless, which I find very disturbing, but quite beautiful. Nathan Taylor, who lives in Hobart, where you're going, and hyper-realist, looking at, he says, I said, what do you do, Nathan? He goes, I'm a landscape painter. You know, I don't paint sheep, I don't paint the big brown land, I paint shopping malls. That's where the landscape of most Australians is. You know, and it's true, we live in this world. More of us probably congregate in a shopping mall than we do out in the wide open world. And he's done these wonderful paintings of abandonment. He looks at notions of abandonment in the landscape. This is a wonderfully designed, Danish designed garbage collection unit by a very famous Danish designer, and it's been totally, which is what it's supposed to do, but he's looking at the notion that, you know, beautiful things, beautifully made, get trashed and abandoned. Jason Benjamin, the landscape never leaves Australia. It's part of who we are. Again, what's interesting thing about this contemporary artist is he's really clearly referencing that German, you know, that German romanticism. You saw very clearly that nature of the light and the God. He's not religious, but he's spiritual, and that's what he would say, that God again is in the landscape. He's actually gone backwards to go forwards. And I'll leave you with this. In a sense, this is Joseph McLellan, and it's just, saw it the other day. This is the 150th anniversary of the New South Wales Police Force, and remember I talked to you about, you know, Kelly and the police force and that the big shootout, and, you know, we're very much an anti-authoritarian people, and Joseph wanted to actually show that really for most of our history the police force has been something very good, and that they've been demonised by a popular culture. So he's done this really heroic image of a photograph of a trooper, mounted police, which he superimposes into a uniform and superimposes with a 19th century background. But down here is a fox, an element of cunning. And across here is an element of bracken, which is actually blackberry bush, which is an imported weed. So he kind of layers it slightly with meaning. So I think that's the last slide. But, you know, in a very short period of time, we've kind of rollicked through 200 years of Australian art. But I guess what I wanted to leave you with is this notion that, you know, we started off as this kind of, we were founded on the way back from a scientific experiment. We're a colony that was populated to remove convicts out of England. We grew into a food bowl. We extremely expanded with the gold rush, which changed the nature of who we are quite significantly in terms of the development of a middle class, the influx of Chinese people in the 1850s, the movement inland in Australia. Then we started to move beyond the gold rush into landed wealth, into pastoral empires, into sheep, into a country that had been untouched by war. We gave a lot in war, and we in fact have almost never not been at war. In one sense, we are quite a war-like people. But we survived in a sense because we've never been touched by war. And right up into early 20th century, we were a land of great abundance and wealth. Modernism came here quite late because of the First World War, but it came quite strongly amongst a small group of women. It developed really significantly and strongly. The Second World War comes along. Our artists started to look internally at the damage that had done to our society. Our paintings were tough. We moved through that kind of modernist period to late modernism with people like Rosalie Gascoigne and Brett Whiteley and those kind of images of urban Australia, which were quite positive. We also start to re-engage with the bush. It's not our foe anymore, it's our friend. We live in the bush. It's okay, we're not going to be burnt to death or get lost. And I suppose the sensibilities of much, you know, contemporary art in the last 20 years is a varying degree, like every society, looking at the individual, referencing classical imagery, looking at individual language, individual practice, myth, personal, landscape, tradition. So, Australian art has evolved. It's changed in 200 years. You're going to Hobart. Is everyone here going to Hobart? An absolute must is to visit Mona, which is a museum, the Museum of Old and New, which opened January, I think, about last year. It is the most extraordinary thing that has been done in this country. It is world amazing. It is 4 floors underground, a pharaonic accumulation of world contemporary art by a guy called David Walsh, of quite frankly confronting and amazing installation. I think the next step for Australia is through people like David Walsh and the museum, which is quite extraordinary, is probably a greater re-engagement with the world. We're going to start moving away from our own little island to being probably integrated with the world, particularly obviously within Asia and China. But I noticed that Mona wasn't on any kind of literature, but it is the most important art museum in this country at the moment, and is absolutely worth a visit if you get a chance in Hobart. In fact, it's an absolute must-see. You'll come back probably shell-shocked and breathless, but it'll never leave you for the rest of your life. Okay, well that's 200 years of Australian art and, gosh, an hour and 10 minutes. If you've got any questions, please ask them. There's no... I'm doing another talk on Aboriginal art, which will be very specific, I think in a couple of days. I'm not actually sure of the date. Yes?
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Which artists have actually made it to, say, Europe, America, besides Williams?
Not many. No, not a lot. Brett Whiteley had a bit of an impact. He was purchased by the Tate. Not a great deal. We still are quite an isolated culture, and we are so distinctly different from the rest of the world in terms of light and geography that we haven't translated very well. So expats buy it. I mean, Australians who live overseas are big collectors of Australian art, but there are few major international collections of Australian art. This is completely different from Aboriginal art, which we can talk about. That is collected internationally and has been done for a very long period of time. Some of the major collections are actually overseas. But what we're looking at today is Australian contemporary art, and that in fact I think is underrepresented overseas. Now, what is interesting is if you follow this kind of cultural thread, that art has always followed money. It doesn't take a genius to realise that when you talk about, the birth of art in a Western situation is the Renaissance. And where did the Renaissance happen? It happened in Florence. And why did it happen in Florence? Because it was the grain market of Italy. And why did it happen with the Medicis? Because they were the grain kings of Italy. They had enormous wealth. They were patrons to the arts. Art and money have always gone hand in hand. Look at all the great centres of the world, and they're the wealth centres. New York in the 20th century, Paris in the 19th century, England in the 18th century, and again in the early 20th century. The art market, the art world has always followed the economies. Artists have always gone to wealth. We are told in this nation that we are going to have 100 years of unparalleled growth. We are digging stuff out for the rest